We will obviously be announcing a total later in the month once all our second round of giving and all of that kind of stuff has come through. If it caught you by surprise today, feel free to throw an IOU in the bucket or anything like that. We just love partnering together. Feel like we are shaping the nations. We've been doing a little mini-series on the topic of creation care. This is the last one. Next week we will be plunging right on into Titus and we'll be kicking us off. But it's become clear, we can whoop that. It's become clear that in the last 50 years or so, the term or the topic of the environment, it's moved from this fringe issue to front page news. The world around us is changing. And the full extent of it is kind of an unknown. But ecology is not an obscure branch of science anymore. It's frontline, it's ideology, it's politics. And the issues are wide and varied. It's not a one single issue topic, but it's influenced by industrial development, land degradation, deforestation, species extinction, biodiversity, ecosystems, water degradation, pollution, alteration of the atmosphere, energy reserves and resources, cultural degradation, and weather instability. And even if some of the topics that hit the news you don't subscribe to, there's enough in there for us to be interested and aware of this topic. Because there's an overwhelming consensus among thousands of climatologists, meteorologists, geologists, biologists, biogeochemists, oceanographers, and all those other ifs. Over the last 30 years, the world has changed. And that's problematic. And it's significantly, if not exclusively, impacted by human actions. Not one simple issue with one simple solution, but lots of different factors. So here I am as one ordinary Christian in a flood of information, fake news, and uncertainty. I'm not a big business or a government with an international voice. What do I do? How do I respond? How can I make a difference? Always helpful to start with the Bible, so we'll go for it first. If I could have my passage safe, that'd be great. We're going to be looking at Malachi this morning. Malachi 6. With what shall I come before the Lord? What can I bring? What can I do? In the face of worldwide challenges, with me and my small little voice, with what can I come before the Lord? How can I bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come with some burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Seems like a huge waste of olive oil. Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He's shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. The word Malachi, it means messenger. It's not totally clear whether this is a prophetic title or a particular person's name. But the Hebrews have been in exile. They've been oppressed, conquered people, displaced to foreign lands. But eventually the Persian king, ruler of the empire, sends Ezra and then later Nehemiah to rebuild their home. which is an incredible turn of events. It's almost like a second Exodus. And despite the incredible rescue, the people have real short memories. And they quickly return to sinful patterns of behavior and corruption. The society literally falls apart, it seems, and worship degenerates into this listless repetition and idolatry and empty nominalism. So Malachi warns them, God will come like a refiner's fire and purify his people. So he calls them to a repentance and a reformation, to start again. How do we get back on track? What shall I bring as my act of worship? Shall I come with religious rituals, with my wealth, my rams and my oils, with my children? It's a sad reality that there were gods of the nations where bringing your children as a living sacrifice for execution was an act of worship. Malachi points them back to the law of Moses. And he says, God's already shown you what real worship looks like. None of those things. So what does the Lord require of you? We read it twice before. To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. It's a strapline over us as a church, as the people of God. And some people have argued that we should completely detach spiritual life with the material world. But in reality, none of us actually lives like that. All of us have come clothed with the material world this morning. These are very practical. Act, love, and walk. Pushing them to reshape their society and culture to mirror a social justice that was ingrained in the religious law that Moses had established under God's hold of stone. Get back to the framework that God gave the Hebrews when he first freed them from slavery and made them a nation of their own. A society that was based upon worship and upon ethical principles. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that those ethics, those societal ethics, had a link with what we would now call ecological ethics. Specific provisions to maintain a balanced, sustainable, and just economy based around cultivating the land. Just a few examples. You've got the Year of Jubilee, which declares freedom and release for those who are in poverty or slavery, which included the redistribution of land to rebalance social inequality. The Sabbath day provided rest for humans, which we know about, but also for animals. The Sabbath year provided rest for the land because fields were left fallow. For the Hebrew community, individual gain and personal autonomy, personal decisions, were overruled by a societal command given by God. The Mosaic law guided people to consider long-term sustainability and justice in the community over personal short-term gain. And it contained prophetic warnings, which we don't talk about a lot in our culture, but about inevitable consequences of a corrupt society. And many of those actually were to do with the land. They were ecological. Crop failure, animal disease, plagues, soil degradation, disrupted agriculture, unjust economy, culture degradation, and health impact. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Ultimately, the nation would be uprooted from its land, disconnected from the land itself. And this was the promised land that had been promised to their founding father, Abraham. A just society requires a connection with the land itself. Being God's people doesn't just mean a relationship between God and the people, but a relationship between God, the people, and the land. Now, none of this suggests that the church should just reapply the Mosaic law, lock, stock, and barrel. And we're not returning to an agrarian society where we all work the land. Although if you have a garden, this is the time. The sun is out. But there are lessons to be learned in the way that God wove respect and care for the land into the societal framework. Malachi says to the Hebrew people, God's already shown you what's good. You're in a mess because you've abandoned the first principles about what society should look like. Get back to basics. Act justly. Love mercy. And walk humbly with God. Over the last couple of weeks, we've looked at some real important themes. We've affirmed the goodness of creation, celebrated that it was made by God to be abundant and beautiful and stable for life to flourish. And we've recognized that God instructed humans to steward creation, to nurture it just as God had, and encouraged a devotional life which enjoys the wonder of creation because it points to the God who created. Our Western culture here in the UK is a pretty self-centered creed, individualistic by nature. Identity is less and less about belonging to a family or a community. It seems to be self-determined so that self can actualize. It's an individualistic society that either removes God altogether or reduces him down to this light spiritualism where God has no authority to shape or challenge our choices. The material world belongs to our God. But if we're not careful, we make it our God. Our belly becomes our God. A constant desire for more and for acquisition. What we have becomes a trophy, but in the end, our glory becomes our shame. We worship the accumulation of stuff, and the marketing world around us says that what we wear defines our identity or our status. It creates an illusion of security, that by having all the right things and experiences, somehow we're safe in this world. And it's pervasive. It's everywhere. It's all around us. We hardly notice it anymore. It's in the air we breathe. Identity expressed by stuff. Invent, define, and express yourself. Above all, spend. Success is measured in influencers and followers. Have a brand, have a platform, have a voice. Convenience is king. Same-day delivery to your door. Fast fashion, disposable resources, technology that's obsolete by the time it comes out of the box. Surely this is the emperor's new clothes. We're all watching the parade, and none of us wants to be the lone voice that says, that king is naked. It's empty. It's frail. It's broken. It doesn't work. Christianity isn't about behavior modification. I'm not standing here giving you a set of instructions, do X, Y, and Z. It's a discipleship journey of understanding who God is, walking with God, finding our identity in Christ, being united with him. It's an identity so transformed that the Bible calls it being born again. It's like a whole fresh start from darkness into light, delivered from the perishable, born into eternal hope. Once a slave to sin, now ransomed and redeemed, adopted into the family of God, a co-heir with Jesus, the indwelling of the Spirit that guarantees our eternal inheritance to come, a place of dignity and peace in the Father's house. Because of Jesus, we'll eat at the King's table, forever seated in heavenly places. That's an identity shift that completely transforms who we are and how we behave. As we abide in him, as we remain in the vine, our minds are renewed and refreshed, and we mature to a full measure of Christ, and the fruits of the Spirit grow in our lives. Identity shapes choices. My Father is a remarkable creating God who has taught me to steward creation and to love my neighbor, to resist greed because Christ is my greatest treasure, that my identity comes from him, not my possessions, my status, or my image, to resist wastefulness because we're stewards of our resources, commissioned to enable creation to flourish, not diminish under our care. I'm super wary of sensationalized, over-dogmatic, politicized language, a single issue of salvation or catastrophe. But I love the biblical instruction to walk humbly with God. It's what we want to do, isn't it? Live with God, to experience closeness with him in every decision, in every moment of our lives, in every setting. Humility recognizes that Jesus is God and I'm not. We don't have all the answers, but he's king over everything. We're not building our throne, but worshiping him. This humility, it speaks of a simplicity. Living simply is restorative and releasing and life-giving, and it's measured. Anya said the other week that buying less stuff had become spiritually transformative for her, like it had somehow recalibrated her identity and instincts. Malachi says, walk humbly with your God. Walking's a basic human function, right? It doesn't get any more simple than that. And often it's outside, and it's mind, and it's body, and it's spirit. And it forces a measured pace, not attempting multiple things at once, everything at the last minute. It's like a metronome for the spirit, brings the spinning head into rhythm and order. Simplicity means properly processing life and our inner life with God, inclining my heart to him, listening for his prompts, tuning my spirit to his, processing, not burying emotions, recognizing the external and the internal factors that push and pull my choices, discerning those that are healthy, those that are unhealthy, and adjusting. Jesus challenged his disciples to resist the patterns of the culture. And he pointed them to the natural world. He said, look, God provides for the lilies and the birds. You don't need to be anxious about what you have, but trust God. And the natural world, it meets the needs of the birds and the lilies and all the other creatures that God made, because creation is sufficient. But it's only sufficient when they use the resources they need. It seems only humans have bucked the trend and started to gather more than we need. And it's a crunching clash with modern materialistic society, constant thirst and overconsumption. This political drive, we must grow the economy for higher standards of living. We had a really interesting report from a think tank in Brussels that was talking about there are actually other economic systems than the constant drive for more. The result is a depletion of natural resources and possibly a depletion of our souls. You know, when I visit the Trafford Centre, I can feel the flesh rising. It's like every shop window screams for my attention. I mean, it's screaming for my money, but like they know the root to my money is my attention. And it touches my identity in a weird way. And when I walk in Mac Forest, my spirit settles. I connect with God. And temptation seems to loosen its grip. And do you know what? When I'm walking in Mac Forest, I never think I'd like to buy an iPhone. It just doesn't happen. Peace washes over anxiety. And it also touches my identity. It's like they're two different gods, isn't it? Two different operating systems. I can't worship both God and money. I can't draw my identity. I can't place my security in both. One's got to be reduced to simple functionality, and the other one has to be released to fill every area of my life. It's a slow process of taming my instincts towards simplicity, walking humbly with God, surrendering my choices to Jesus, not to market forces or culture or fashion, making judgments based on values, not convenience, not mindlessly conforming to the patterns of the world, pulled about by currents as if I had no choice, but actually making choices guided by the Spirit. Ben said last week, we don't need one person doing everything perfectly, which is a relief. But we need 1 million people making the best choices they can imperfectly. I may have savaged that quote. I'm sorry. Kind of detached from the environmental world because much of it doesn't impact here. We can't see it. We're largely protected. Pollution's out of sight. Soil erosion is happening somewhere else. We don't see the smoke of the forests burning. We need pressure hasn't forced much. What we do see is in the media, not in our streets. It's very different if we live in Bangladesh with its flooding, or Zambia with its droughts, or Brazil where the rainforests are. But the New Testament ethic is based on two very clear instructions. One is to love God with our whole heart and mind and soul and spirit and strength and everything we have. And the other is to love our neighbor as ourselves. Loving God means honoring and stewarding the gift of creation because it came from the God that we love. And loving our neighbor means protecting their basic human rights for the present generation, but also the generations to come. The link between environmental degradation and world poverty is really obvious. I'm going to oversimplify it to the point where it's almost unhelpful, but overconsumption by some means that there isn't enough for others. Overuse of resources and the gathering of resources means that there are none left for others. Damage to the environment for the short term destroys the livelihood of others. Not all countries have the same environmental impact. Not all are impacted in the same way by environmental shifts. In fact, it's distinctly unequal. There's an ingrained structural inequality to it. Wealthier nations and industries, they consume more resource and emit more pollution. And poorer countries experience the worst of the consequences. Malachi says we should love justice. Not a gentle nod from a distance, but actually love it. To be motivated by it. When Jo and I were first dating, she was in Norwich, I was in Salford. I was motivated to drive 5.5, sometimes a lot more hours, across the country to go and see her because it was driven by a love. A love for justice will cause us to go out of our way, sometimes on a big fat detour, sometimes through inconvenience, sometimes through traffic, sometimes through obstacles, but it will cause us to change the way we do things in the direction we're on because we are naturally motivated by it. It's not a gentle nod to the instructions. It's a change, a shift in motivation, which is why I talked about identity at the beginning, that sense of not just about behavior modification, it's about understanding who we are and who he is. There are structural inequalities all around the world. Globally, women have fewer resources, less autonomy, and fewer choices. Indigenous people, they're a significant stewards of a whole portion of world's biodiversity, but their land and their livelihood is under threat. People with disabilities encounter increased risks to health and access to public services. Again, we don't see that so much here, but in other nations, it's a very real thing. We see governments and businesses that set themselves robust climate change goals, but it seems like there's absolutely no accountability when those deadlines come and go. And the vulnerable groups that are most affected are not at the table for those meetings. Sadly, more wealth seems to mean more waste. And the poorest half of the global population accounts for only a small portion of the world's population. Low-income countries, they suffer more from climate-induced crisis, but have least resources available to respond. Today's young people, they're going to live on the planet long after I'm gone. But decisions made today will shape what their lives look like. The truth is that extreme weather events threaten the basic needs and the human rights of whole communities. Food and water shortages, disease, inflation, poverty, displacement of whole communities being moved. If God calls us to love justice, then surely that means, as far as possible, enabling all individuals to thrive, or at least protecting the basic human rights that actually we take for granted every day of our lives. Truth is, we can't correct all the injustice of the world. But it does bring us back to Malachi. What can I do? What can I bring as my act of worship? What does God require? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God, to receive his mercy in our lives and cherish it, to worship him as Lord and King, to prefer the needs of others, to live simply, to steward what we have with care, to love God with everything we have and love our neighbor as ourselves, pursuing justice in our communities and to embody the heart of God for the marginalized in every area of life. Now, to help me land this, I'm going to invite friends Johan and Andy to come up and join us. I'm just going to do a little bit of furniture removal so that people over that side can see them. While they come and shuffle on up. Can you see all the way over there? Does that work? Take a seat, guys. Let me take the one off the end. You can have that. And you can have that. And I'll take that. Sitting comfortably. We'll begin, shall we? Are they on? Are we good, Dan? Let me have a quick... Oh, there we go. Are they both on? You're good. Hello. Do you have a sense of which channel it is? Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. You should. Yeah. Do. Okay, we're all good. Great. So, strategically chosen friends this morning. We have Johan, who works in sustainable energy, and we have Andy, who is a trustee at Jubilee Plus. So, where should we start? Probably most helpful, I think, Johan, if you start by explaining what on earth your job is. That's really helpful. How long have I known you?
Good luck. This is going to take like 10 minutes. I work for a project at the moment called the West of Orkney Wind Farm. Guess where it is? It's west of Orkney.
Okay.
So it's in the north of Scotland. And I am responsible for anything that has to do with the seabed and below. So essentially where you put your structures and is, knowing and understanding the seabed conditions and the soil underneath where the wind turbines eventually are going to be put into. So that's what I do.
So we hear quite a lot about renewable energy. For those of us that are really at ground zero basics, tell us, what's the problem with traditional sources of energy and fossil fuels?
So traditional sources of energy are essentially derived from some sort of combustion. Whether it's a nuclear reactor, whether it's a thermal turbine, or it's just burning something. And fossil fuels, as a byproduct of combustion, you get CO2, which is a greenhouse gas that essentially helps retain heat in the atmosphere. It sounds great. Like a warmer UK will be great, but it doesn't work like that. Essentially, it affects weather patterns and is overall detrimental. So that's the problem with fossil fuels. Well, one of the problems of fossil fuels. The other problem is that they will run out. So eventually, we will run out of gas to burn and oil to turn into petrol and diesel.
Right. So give us an idea, what are renewable sources and why are they good?
There's so many of them, but I'll talk about the big ones. So essentially, wind is a big one. Hydroelectricity, even though it has environmental implications, is technically renewable. You have solar as well. So I think these are three big ones. And the advantage of them essentially is that wind should not run out. I mean, it may change with weather patterns changing, and that's something that's is currently brought into consideration when a wind farm, so the climate change impact. But technically, you have it there. The same, once you build a dam and have the water there through the lifespan of the dam, technically you should have that. Again, climate change can impact that because the water doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from somewhere. And then solar, the same. You have the sun there, as Joe said. Sometimes you cannot see it, but technically it just goes through the clouds and it generates electricity.
Right. So if it's that straightforward, why aren't all energy resources renewable sources?
So it's global market, technology driven, and overall, finally a profit thing. So the technology to generate renewable energy is not as mature as the technology to extract oil from the ground, convert that into something, and then eventually get energy out of it. We've been doing that for years now, and it's established mature technology. Whereas renewable technologies are emerging. Some of them are mature, like onshore wind. We've done that for a long time. Offshore wind is fairly mature, but the global market is not there. It's a very good market in the UK. That's why there's a lot of offshore wind farms in the UK, and the UK is kind of spearheads that effort in the world and exports the know-how. But in general, not every single country has the resources and the technology to develop a renewable energy source. Solar is a little bit more straightforward. It's not as critical as infrastructure as a wind farm. But overall, oil still is very profitable. There is a global market. So every single place in the world you'll find petrol. And every single place in the world has to or depends on this for energy, for their cars. I don't have an electric car, so I need diesel for my car. And that's the reason. Still, oil and gas is a very profitable thing to do. And companies, or big companies that are transitioning, and there is a transition, obviously there's more renewable energy coming in, but why the transition has not gone faster is a profit thing. And we've seen it recently with BP kind of, making a U-turn on their goals or ambitions to full transition from oil and gas into renewables. And essentially their shareholders complain, it's like, Exxon is the 200% share price increase and you are at 12%. And essentially, ultimately, is a great thing, a money thing.
Wow, grand. It's really helpful. So we'll come back to kind of maybe what we can do here. But one of the things I learned from Dan the other day is that when you're setting up your British Gas account, you can actually dictate what percentage of your gas supply you want to come from a biogas source, which means we can start to make small step choices along the way, just gradual increments. What other things are there that, obviously, we're not going to set up a renewable energy company. I don't know, somebody might. Like, what are the simple and obvious things that people here on the ground can start to do?
I think what you say is a very good one. Not only just setting up where your gas comes from, but also there are some companies that your energy is 100% renewable. They guarantee that. Another one, a little bit more obscure, if you want, is banking, the banking system. So there is a bank, I forgot the name now, but it may come later, that all their dealings, so essentially they lend your money only to fund, renewable projects and environmentally conscious, initiatives. So like every single bank is lending your money to someone and charging a fee for it. This specific bank, I mean, you could put your money to good use. I mean, your money's still there, no one's going to take it away. But essentially, it can be invested into those renewable projects. And that really easy things to change your bank and supply is not necessarily more expensive. This particular bank that I'm talking about, which I'll find,
just say the name down the microphone.
I think I researched it in the past. I just want to give, I am by no means an authority on this. I work for my parent company. Ultimately, it's an oil and gas company. He started in oil and gas and now shifting to renewables. As I say, my car is diesel. I'm by no means an authority on this, and I bank with Nationwide. So just wanted to put it there. I'm not telling you to do things.
Give him the same question, because he's got
those types of issues are prevalent. Basically, the right answer is local churches to be dealing with those issues in the communities, as we are here in Macclesfield. But Jubilee Plus aims to help those churches to have the resources and the understanding they need to do that properly.
Mm-hmm. You're loitering. Do you need us to switch your microphone or?
Oh.
It's all right, because you've got a great voice that projects across the room, so I suspect people did still hear you.
It's more just about live stream.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Turn it down.
So Jubilee Plus is about addressing poverty, equipping churches,
Yeah.
particularly structural inequalities and justice.
Yeah.
So I mentioned a couple of examples, but maybe you could open up on those more for me about how creation care links to social justice.
Okay, so in my mind, social justice or a social justice issue occurs any time that I do something that disadvantages somebody else. And obviously that's pretty broad. And with climate or creation care, but thinking about maybe the climate change angle of that, one of the big issues is that we don't know the people that we are impacting. And actually the majority of the people that we're impacting haven't even been born yet, because the high levels of CO2 that are in the atmosphere right now will be there for hundreds of years, even if we were to dramatically reduce our emissions tomorrow morning, which clearly isn't going to happen. So there's unfortunately there's an inevitable legacy of what has already happened in terms of our CO2. So the other aspect, I think, is that the oceans and the atmosphere do a great job of sort of redistributing climate impact around the world. So we can have a factory here in Macclesfield emitting CO2 that ends up contributing to drought in Zambia, for example. That's why we have to have this this sort of global understanding, and why we can't just think about, oh, it would be nice if it was a bit warmer in Macclesfield, or a bit less wet or something, because actually we do need to think about the impact that we're having around the world. And as you said in your preach, the rich countries are actually reasonably well placed to either put in place measures like flood defences to mitigate sort of the risk of flood, or if disaster does hit, they've got the money to put it right and to rebuild lives. But obviously poor countries don't do that. And quite often, as you say, when poor countries are hit, people end up impoverished, displaced, and quite often dead. So that's a very real social justice issue. Yeah, I mean, you spoke about Bangladesh, which we probably all know is a very low-lying country. 170 million people, total population. 50 million of them live at a height above sea level of less than 5 meters. That's up to my bedroom ceiling. When the tsunami hit in the Indian Ocean in 2004, that killed 250,000 people. But the highest waves in that were 50 meters, 10 times the height of my bedroom ceiling. And if those waves had hit in Bangladesh, how many million people would have been killed? The other, so sort of switching to the fair trading type of stuff. I mean, we all like a bargain, don't we? And we're all probably having to shop wisely in order to make our resources go round in times of high cost of living. But actually, quite a lot of those goods are coming from, well, particularly Asia. And the conditions under which the people who are producing those goods are working are pretty horrendous. So they will be working for a pittance in very, very poor working conditions. And the more we buy those goods, the longer that's going to continue. I mean, as you said, money and profit is really at the root of a lot of this. But again, if we can buy ethically, and I would suggest buy as little as you can, don't buy stuff you don't need. And if you can, buy stuff that's going to last and not wear out, or get second-hand stuff, because the whole manufacturing cycle is one of the greatest contributors to climate change, and to therefore, particularly with these exporting nations, to the social injustice side of that as well.
Yeah, I remember very clearly. Joe's dad used to work for Fair Trade before he retired, and part of his job was the quality assurance of the mark, and so assessing companies to check that the products that they were producing were indeed fair trade. And I remember very clearly the summer where he said, "You can't tell anyone, but Cadbury's making a fair trade chocolate